They dominated the Murray skyline for as long as anyone can remember. Two stacks, giant industrial chimneys which came to stand along 53rd South, decades before the asphalt and interstate, the mirrored glass buildings, before a single plane had crossed the sky overhead, or anyone had even imagined a thing called the internet. They were here when the roads were dirt and clay, when horses and shoe leather, rather than high-speed trains and automobiles, were the means of making the morning commute. Now, more than a half-century after the smelting industry closed up shop and left town forever, their purpose and their story has been virtually forgotten. Once, such giant brick chimneys were a common sight in industrialized America. But in the past few decades, they have all but disappeared, as one after another has been brought down. By the year 2000, the Murray stacks were virtually the last of their kind left standing in any American city. At 455 feet in height, the larger stack reaches high into the Utah sky, as tall or taller than the glass and steel towers in the city to the north. Alongside the big stack, its smaller, older companion, but smaller is a relative term because at 295 feet in height, it stands only 10 feet shorter than the Statue of Liberty. While their height certainly is impressive, so too is their sheer mass. Standing 34 feet across at its base, the smaller stack weighs in at 8,400,000 pounds. That's 8.4 million pounds of brick. And the larger stack, its 85-foot diameter base alone weighs 8 million pounds. And resting on that, 12,300,000 pounds of brick. And the stack itself is 48 feet across at its base. And the interior measures 1,100 square feet. That's about the same square footage as a small house.
Millions and millions of bricks all stacked on top of each other, totally by hand.
Most amazingly, the millions of pounds of brick, thousands of tons of sand, gravel, and concrete that went into the construction of these stacks were not brought in and moved about by modern heavy equipment. Webb Snar's uncle was part of that back-breaking, low-tech effort.
It was his project when the stacks were built to haul the sand and gravel that made up the stacks.
Wheelbarrows and shovels, calloused hands, and horse-drawn wagons were the principal tools used in this massive project.
It was hard work.
It was also masterful work. German-born Alphonse Custodes was the undisputed master of brick chimney building. The developer of a special radial brick, Custodes' stacks could be built perfectly round, gracefully tapered, elegant beyond anything possible using today's modern building techniques. And experts agree the large Murray stack is one of his very best works.
Beautiful. They're incredible craftsmanship. You wouldn't see that today. There's just no one around that would have that skill of laying that type of brick, getting it the taper consistent, the full height, the roundness of the column. It's like a machine built the thing.
But these giants were built by hand, and they are gigantic. The Murray stacks can be seen from as far away as the state capitol building 15 miles to the north, and from just about any elevated location in the entire valley. You always know where Murray is, right there at the base of those big stacks.
When I've been on trips, coming back and seeing those smelter stacks, I know I'm close to home.
They clearly mark the point where Murray is in the valley, and perhaps more importantly, where it stands in Utah history. The city, after all, was born beneath the smoky haze of the smelter's blast furnace nearly a century before.
The mining and smelting industry is what made Murray what it is.
It is exquisitely critical, particularly to a place like Murray. It was almost everything.
The big stacks are part of a long and remarkable story, a story that begins decades before these twin brick columns rose up here on this ridge. It's a story that began soon after the first Mormon settlers arrived in the valley of the Great Salt Lake more than 150 years ago. In 1848, just 1 year after the Mormon settlers had arrived, they found more than freedom from religious persecution in their new home. Ore-bearing rock, laced with silver and lead, was discovered in the Salt Lake Valley. 6 years later, even larger, richer deposits were discovered in Little Cottonwood Canyon, just 10 miles from what one day would become Murray. But digging the metal-laden ore out of the ground would not be enough. Harvesting the valuable metals meant freeing them from the rock, and that required the furnaces of a smelter. But smelters were hundreds of miles away, so Utah's metallic treasures remained inaccessible for nearly 20 more years. In June of 1870, all that began to change. The first smelter was built in what would become the Murray area. The Whittle Brothers smelter was small and crude by modern standards, but it produced ingots of metal, beginning a flow of refined gold, silver, copper, and lead that would continue for decades, aided in no small part by another 1870s addition to the valley's expanding industrial resources, the railway.
In 1870, the railroad came through this area. And with the advent of the railroad, it made it easier to bring ore in and get the products of smelting out.
By 1872, smelting was well established in the South Valley. The largest, most advanced smelter yet began operation in November of that year. It was called Germania. A brilliant engineer, F. Anton Eilers, developed new, highly productive techniques for smelting metals at the plant.
The work that was being done in Murray, particularly at the Germania smelter at the time, was revolutionary.
Considered the father of modern lead and silver smelting, Eilers put Murray on the world map and Utah metals production into high gear. So while a growing stream of metal flowed out of Utah on the new railroad, immigrants looking for work at the booming smelters began to flood in.
There were Southern Slavs, there were Italians, there were Greeks, there were Northern Europeans. There were also Orientals who settled here. The Chinese came in after the railroad was built. The Japanese came in with the mining and then on to the smelters. So it was a very diverse population, not at all like your standard Utah Mormon village.
Many smelter workers settled in an area owned by a Swiss farmer named Christian Berger. It became known as Burgertown. Within walking distance of the smelters, fortunate smelter families found shelter in modest frame homes. Others were at times left with less comfortable accommodations.
They lived in very small homes that were probably owned by the smelter a lot of the time, even in tent towns sometimes.
The largest segment of the immigrant population, about half of all smelter workers, were Greek. The Greeks brought some unique elements of culture and color into Murray, an influence that persisted well into the next century. Aspects of Greek culture, like coffee houses, brought an exotic and interesting element to State Street.
They'd sit there and drink their coffee, and they also had these water pipes. I can see them big fancy water pipes, and the guys that sit there at the tables and drink their coffee and smoke their water pipes.
There was at times a bit too much color brought into the valley by smelter workers. Unlike the Mormon settlers, the newcomers were often rough and rowdy by comparison.
It was not Brigham Young's Utah. Brothels, saloons, shootings, lynching problems. You know, it was the Wild West of the 1870s, 1880s, downtown Murray.
It was very wild. In fact, it was said that if you couldn't find a drink anywhere else on State Street, you could find it in Murray. At one time, Murray had 43 bars and saloons. Plus, there were a couple of breweries.
It was about the time one of those breweries and the local dance hall were burned down by smelter boys. The push began to make Murray an incorporated city. Described as a greater threat than the prairie coyote or the mountain lion in a May 1897 Deseret News editorial, the rowdy element and their bad behavior in Murray apparently needed to be brought under control.
The Salt Lake County Sheriff didn't like coming out here. In fact, one of the reasons that Murray actually was incorporated was because the problems that were happening here needed better law enforcement and needed some structure.
But that structure would also mean city taxes, and the big smelter operators wanted none of that. American Smelting and Refining, which bought the Germania smelter in 1899, was planning to build a big new plant in Murray. ASARCO didn't want a big new tax bill to go with it. But despite smelter opposition, Murray became an incorporated city in November of 1902. It was also the year the first of the big stacks and the vast new lead smelter it served went into operation. Smelting was keeping Murray's economy alive and well, but by 1902 it was apparent the same couldn't be said for much else in and around the city.